We are deeply concerned by yet another mass death sentence handed down by an Egyptian court to more than 100 defendants, including former President Morsi. We have consistently spoken out against the practice of mass trials and sentences, which are conducted in a manner that's inconsistent with Egypt's international obligations.
State Department spokesman Jeff Rathke expressing concern about the death sentence handed down to former Egyptian President Mohammad Morsi. You may recall Morsi was Egypt's first democratically elected president, but he could be hanged by the state for his involvement in the 2011 Cairo prison break. However, our State Department says the death sentence imposed upon him and others is inconsistent with Egypt's rule of law. Joining us now, terrorism expert Raymond Ibrahim. Raymond, we thank you very much for your time. And earlier this year, an Egyptian court acquitted Morsi of many of the charges that carry a death penalty. What changed? Why now is he being sentenced to death?
I think there's a lot of politics going on. As you know, come early June, the death sentence could be commuted. I personally expect it will. I think this is possibly for propaganda reasons. I think the Sisi government knows that, Morsi's already out, so is the Muslim Brotherhood. If you actually execute him, he's going to become something of a martyr. And so, it's actually going to give a propaganda boost to the Muslim Brotherhood and those parties. So I think this is actually being done now as sort of kind of a slap in the Muslim Brotherhood's face. But when it comes down to push comes to shove, I personally think I would bet on that they're not going to execute him.
With this going on in Egypt and difficulties in other Arab nations, do we see that the Arab Spring was more sloganeering than reality?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there was a lot of positive aspects to the Arab Spring. There were a lot of open-minded Arabs, Egyptians, Libyans, Syrians, Yemenis, who wanted a more, pluralistic Western-style government, but there were also the Islamist types. And the problem is in Western coverage, you weren't really told of that, the dichotomy of it. And in fact, I think part of that led to this belief in wholesale support from the West and the United States that ultimately helped the most organized groups. In Egypt, for example, it was well known the most organized group was the Muslim Brotherhood. And so they came to power in the United States. The Obama administration was clearly working with them. We know that by the actions of Ann Patterson, the U.S. ambassador in Egypt, who was, if you looked at the revolution that ousted Morsi and the Brotherhood, she was on placards with Obama just being condemned and constantly cursed for being so in cahoots with the Brotherhood at the expense of all the Egyptians and so forth. So definitely you can say it was hijacked. There was potential, but it didn't come to fruition.
You mentioned the political whirlwind going on inside Egypt, but obviously it's not just politics. Shortly after Morsi's sentence was announced, 3 judges were shot to death. The Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists within Egypt, just how inclined toward violence are they?
Oh, they're going to do everything they can because these people, this group was very much entrenched. It got very cocky. It thought it had the people's support. There was nothing that can be done about it. It was very open in its abuse, and it got taken out. So now it's going to do everything it can to try to do what it can to come back to power. But what I find, what we have to keep in mind is, there's this, we're being seen, the Muslim Brotherhood, as the bad guy, the terrorists, so forth, which they are. But what we have to keep in mind is the motivation of the Muslim Brotherhood and these groups is still there, and it's very dominant in Egypt. For example, the Salafis, which in my opinion have a worse ideology, one that's identical to the Islamic State or ISIS, are actually legitimate in Egypt. And these guys are even worse, even though they're playing the game right now with the Sisi government. So that's why I say there's a lot of politics in that it's specifically a Muslim Brotherhood Sisi tug of war. But the motivation, the source, the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood is still well entrenched in Egypt and elsewhere, and that is not being addressed by the Sisi government.
Raymond, we have spoken before principally about Christian persecution, and I'm wondering about the fate of Coptic Christians in Egypt. About a minute 15 remains. Give us a snapshot, as you understand it, of Christian persecution in Egypt and the efforts by the new president to, rhetorically at least, embrace a form of reform for Islam.
Well, sorry to say, even though President Sisi's words have been impressive, on the ground, very little has changed and in many ways has gotten worse for the Copts of Egypt. I was reading in certain areas, especially in Upper Egypt, the Upper Egypt or Southern Egypt, which rarely gets the kind of attention that Cairo or Alexandria does. The Copts there are habitually being abducted, held for ransom, killed, slaughtered, women taken, raped, and a bishop recently came up and did something that's very unprecedented. He actually blamed the officials, the authorities, the police, of not simply ignoring or turning a blind eye, which most people knew, but of actually inciting some of the Muslim population of these regions to do this to the Christians, and things like the authorities will send out a missive to the mosque leaders saying, do you stand with us or the Copts who want to build a church? And if you stand with us, then protest. And then mass people will protest against the proposed building of a church and so forth.
Raymond,
So definitely not better.
you are setting up a picture that is very disturbing, but we thank you for the view as you see it. Raymond Ibrahim will be back.